Right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Tsinghua and UNSW Joint Research Center for International Commercial and Economic Law Conference. Today we will have panel 3. I'm Simin from Tsinghua Law School. I will be a chair for this panel. And the topic for our panel is focused on emerging challenges for digital and green transitions. It's our great honor to have 3 speakers for our panel. They are Professor Deng Haifeng, Professor Guobin, and Professor Zhou Weihuan. Please join me to welcome our speakers. So we will have 4 speakers. Professor Deng Haifeng. Professor Deng Haifeng is also work as the chair for faculty committees of law school, and he's also the director of Center for Environmental, Natural Resources and Energy Law, and Senior Research Fellow of the CDM Development and Research Center of Tsinghua University. And Professor Deng's research is focused on environmental law and natural resources law and energy law. He has published many articles in the international and domestic leading law reviews. And he also is the leader for many research programs on environmental law and energy law. And his presentation will focus on the discussion on the legal issues of China's coastal western lands. So please join me to welcome Professor Deng to give a speech.
Dear friends and colleagues, it's my great honor to attend this international workshop between the Tsinghua Law School and the UNSW. Today, I wanted to share my current research focusing on the legal issues of China's coastal waistline. Here, I wanted to show you the background, why I wanted to do this research. First, I wanted to give a brief introduction about the coastal waistline of China. Just as you know that the coastline of China is 18,000 kilometers, and the coast waistlines are widely distributed in the coastal provinces. But the reclamation, pollution, and overexploitation of the biological resources and other factors had led to the very serious degradation of the coastal waistline. This map, from this map, we could see that the distribution of the coastal waistline of China, they distributed in 11 provinces and Hong Kong, Macau, and other regions. And also it is bounded by the Hangzhou Bay, divided into the north of Hangzhou Bay and the south of Hangzhou Bay. The reason why we wanted to divide into 2 parts because that the plants in the north or south, the coastal waistline are very different. So the second, let's look at the degradation. According to the second National Waistline Resources Survey results, so that the national total area of the waistlines are 15,600,600 hectares, and the offshore of the coastal waistland accounting for about 12.42%. In the last 10 years, China's coastal waistland areas decreased 1.3612 million hectares, and with an average annual disappearance rate of more than 2.2%. So we could see that the level of the degradation is very serious and far from the average of the world. So let's look at the threats and challenges that the Chinese waistline coastal had facing. Also, according to the National Waistline Resources Survey, we could see that nowadays the coastal waistline of China had facing the 3 very important and very serious threats. The first is the over reclamation and renovation. The second is increased pollution. And the last one is excessive use of the biological resources. First, over reclamation and renovation in coastal westland. Just as you know that with the acceleration of the urbanization in coastal province, the demand for land is growing. And after the state policies of the strict protection of the basic farmland was enacted, many places turned to the wetlands for the construction, and which brought a very serious challenges to the coastal wetland protection and development. This picture shows the Guangzhou Nansha district reclamation. The second is increased pollution in coastal wetland. The environmental pollution is one of the most serious threats of the coastal wetland and caused very serious harms to the biodiversity. The pollution of the coastal wetland include a lot of factors. Just as you know that we could see that the sewage discharge, the industrial wastewaters, non-point sources pollution caused or from the use of the fertilizers. That's the reason. And the pollution threats to the coast wetland is rapidly increasing with the development of the industrialization process. This picture also shows a large numbers of heavy chemical industry around the coastal areas, and it increases a very serious environmental pollution. The third challenge is the excessive use of the biological resources. In some important economic waters, overfishing is a very serious problem, and which not only does damage to the important economic fish resources, but also seriously affect the ecological balance of the coastal wetland and lead to challenges in coastal wetland biological community structure and cause the loss of the biodiversity and ecosystem functions. This picture has shown us the fishing situation around the coastal province. So how to deal with these challenges? The Chinese government also has drafted some of the laws and regulations. Now the second part, I wanted to show you the legal framework on the coastal wetland protection. Nowadays, there is no specific legislation of the coastal wetland in our current legislative, but there are some laws and regulations has a very close with the coastal protection. And these laws and regulations, I think that had to do some good efforts to protect the coastal wetland. Let's look at that's the structure of the law and the regulations. At the law level, we have the Wetland Protection Law, the law on the administration of use of the sea areas, and the Land Administration Law, Marine Environmental Protection Law, and the Fishery Law. At the local regulations level, we also has the Jiangsu, Qingdao Coastal Zone Management Regulations, and so on. Now, based these laws and regulations, there has some measures to resolve the challenges I have mentioned above, such as to resolve the over reclamation and renovation coastal wetland. China has established the reclamation plan systems, and every year the state administration will present an annual total national reclamation proposals and the provincial programs. This proposal and provincial programs will based on the reclamation plans each coastal area reported. And in some program, there also has a very serious legal liabilities articles, such as the Article 19. If the reclamation activities exceeded plan indicators, and the approved plan indicators in the region will reduce corresponding according to the Wucho-1 Bako-5 ratio in the next years. That's the first measures. The second, in order to solve the problems of the pollution, China Marine Environmental Protection Law also established the sewage charges and the environmental protection tax systems. The Article 12, we could see that the units and individuals that directly discharge the pollutants into the water must pay pollution discharge fees in accordance with the national regulations. And those who had paid the environmental protection tax in accordance with the legal provisions will no longer to pay the pollution discharge fees. Since 2018, the discharge of the atmospheric pollutants, the water pollutants, and solid waste into the sea areas of China requires to pay for the environmental protection taxes. The reason is in that year, the environmental protection taxes legislation come into being. And the last measures is focusing on the overfishing. To solve the problem of overexploitation of the bio resources, China also established the fishing license systems. Based on the fishery law, the Article 23, the state applies the fishing license systems for fishing industry. And also at Article 24, the fishing license approved by the local governments should be adopted to fishing limit indicator. This indicator decided by the administrative department of the higher people's governments. So I think that this system has played a positive role for the sustainable development of the fishery resources in the coastal wetlands. Now we try to draw a conclusion. Now, based on the introduction about the challenges and the measures, could we draw a conclusion that China's coastal wetlands challenges have been resolved? I think the answer is no. Above the legislation provides some basis for the protection of the coastal lands in their respective fields. But however, due to the fact that the coastal wetlands belongs to the category of the general wetland in nature, and they should be protected by the forestry regulatory authority in terms of the managed systems. But in the matter of the threats to them, even all the issues are not in charge of by the forestry regulatory authority, such as the pollution as the responsibility of the Environmental Protection Agency. And we also could see that the marine engineering is responsible by the Marine Management Department. This department nowadays in the Natural Resources Department. And the third is the climate adoption and the disaster reduction is the responsibility of the Civil Affairs Department. And the Sustainable Resources Utilization is the Natural Resources Management Department's responsibility. So the multiple source of the government had led to a clear disadvantages in its protection. So how to deal with this situation? We gave a suggestion about this situation that the state should change its approach and use the concept of the natural ecological space. Use this concept to protect the coastal wetland in the proposed the natural resource reserve law. This law had been first had been submitted to the State Council, and the designation of the key coastal wetland as natural parks or wetland parks, and the implementation of a system of coordinated management by park management agencies to solve the current unfavorable situation. why we designation of the coast westland as a natural park or the westland park could draw these issues, because that in our park management systems designed by the natural reserve law, the department will be designation as a comprehensive management department, and the responsibility of this kind of the authorities will cover the pollution control, cover the natural resources sustainable development, planning, zoning, and so on. So use this concept, natural ecological space, could deal with the complex situation about the governance of the coastal wetlands. So that's the answer. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much for Professor Deng's presentation. In his presentation, he has discussed about the current approach adopted by Chinese policymakers and governments to deal with the wetland issues, and he also proposed a new approach to have a comprehensive protections of the western land, which is used the more comprehensive concept called the natural ecological space to have a better approach for protection. All right, we have a next speaker coming from Tsinghua University, Professor Guobin. Please allow me to have a very brief introduction for Professor Guobin. Professor Guobin is a professor and also the director of the Center of Intellectual Property Law at Tsinghua University Law School. He was the Associate Dean for International Affairs and Research from 2016 to 2019. So he's the founder for our center. And Professor Tri research interesting, including intellectual property law, antitrust law, property law, and also law and economic theory. And he teach IP law and patent law, and IP licensing, and Chinese civil law. And he also he has published many articles in the top law journals on those areas. And he has two very popular case book on IP law and also on the copyright law. And please, Professor Guobin will give a speech on the regulation of the algorithm recommendation under the copyright law. So please join me to welcome Professor Tri to give a speech.
Okay, good morning to everyone. Thank you, Deng Gao, for your introduction. And personally, I'm very happy to be part of this event again. Actually, I participated in all the joint events since the very beginning. This year, probably the fourth or the fifth time. Very happy to see all the old friends and new friends again. Today, I would like to topic on the regulation of algorithm recommender system under the copyright law. Recently, China, there's a lot of high-profile cases on this kind of issue. That's why I choose this topic. It's also, this presentation also based on present a very interesting topic on the regulation of algorithmic recommender system. And the here shows the today we'll cover this. My presentation will cover this kind of 6 parts. The first one give a very brief introduction to the algorithmic recommender system. The second one talk about the existing legal framework for regulating this kind of system. And the third one we talk about the legal nature of algorithmic recommendation. Whether we should impose more duty for this kind of system in the future. Last one we talk about whether there's really fifth last one we talk about problem caused by this kind of recommendation system. Okay, the first part, very brief introduction. Here, the algorithmic recommendation means that suggestion generated based on some users' data, such as their previous choice, ratings, or something other information. And now this kind of a system has been widely used by online platforms to provide a personalized service, such as recommending audiovisual works on a platform, or recommend books, products, or any even restaurant service to by a computer. Several examples to show the importance of this kind of system. According to a paper, the YouTube recommendation system now is responsible for generating more than 70% of its view time on the platform. For Amazon aesthetics in 2017, say more than 30% based on this kind of algorithm recommendation. For Netflix, 80%. I think some reports say TikTok and the Chinese one, the Douyin, probably most of the content, 19% are based on this kind of recommendation system. Here, I'll tell you very briefly the mechanism or how it works. Usually, we divided this kind of recommender system, this kind of service, in 3 stages. The first one, the ISP need to put all the works to be recommended together. We call them the pulling works to be recommended. In theory, ISP could recommend any works posted by its users. But in practice, no one want to do this. Sometimes the quality of the work is very poor, right? Or some of the content is politically incorrect, or some even have some unlawful content. So most of the ISP will do this kind of content. In China, we call them content security review. That's why they create a pool and determine which works should be adopted to this kind of pool. When do this kind of content security review? Most of them are not done by their employees manually. They have some kind of automatic system to see whether to review the content, to see whether the content contains some sensitive words, something like that. So no one really watch the films or read the works in person. So that's in this kind of stage. It's still unlikely for the ISP to know whether the content is infringing or not. So because no individual really review the content in person. That's the first stage. The system do all this kind of almost automatically. But in some case, they will, if there's a match between the content and some keywords, and then the ISP may send some reviewers to look at the details of the content. In that kind of exceptional situation, ISP may get some idea about the legal nature of this kind of work, but only in very exceptional situation. That's the first stage. The second stage, once that work has when a work is put into this kind of pool, and then the system will initiate so-called a cold start. The system randomly recommend the content to its users, and then to see the feedbacks. If the user really show this kind of interest in the content, and then the system will increase the weight for this kind of work, and then start to recommend the work to more users. But if the system receives no positive feedback, then probably the system will reduce the weight of the specific work, and then we will see almost no recommendation for that kind of work. This stage, we call them cold start. And then after the cold start, the system apply all kinds of algorithms to recommend this kind of content. Here, I introduce 3 major systems. The first one is so-called content-based recommender system. The system suggests items to a user that are similar in attributes to the item that a user has previously demonstrated interest. That means the system will look at the works has to be reviewed or of the interest of the user. And then if there comes in a new work has the same attributes, and then we recommend the work to the users. Again, that's the first types of recommender system. The second type also will very popular. We call them collaborative filtering recommender system. This system suggests items to users based on the interests of fellow users. For example, if the first users like the work A and B and C, and then the second users also like the work A and B, but we don't know whether the second user like the work C, right? But we look at the first user's experience. We know if a user like A and B is likely the second user will also like the work C, right? So, and then we recommend the work C to the second user. So this recommendation is based on the first user's experience at this platform. So no one care about what's the content of ABC, but only care about whether the first user really like the combination ABC. So the second user may also like ABC. So that's the mechanism. The third one, the knowledge-based recommender system, is pretty similar to the first one, but it's a little bit different. The third system only look at the attributes of the user or the content. We don't look at the experience at this kind of platform. For example, if the user claim is a man, he like sports or something like that, and then look at the video to all the items to see whether they have attribute of for a man or for a sport. So if there's a match, and then recommend the item to the user. So that this is a major three types of recommender system. I think know the mechanism is very important. We know if you know this kind of mechanism, you will see during this kind of recommendation, actually the ISP don't care about the real content of the work. So it's also very difficult for the almost no need for the ISP to know whether the content is infringing or not. That's the mechanism. Why the recommendation system causes this kind of controversy? That's because by applying this kind of system, the ISP promotes this kind of copyright content to its users, also for the pirate copyright content. So make a lot of copyright owners happy. They want to, since you promote the pirate content, so you should bear higher duty of care. That's their logic. So now we will talk about under the existing copyright law, whether this kind of logic should be supported. The second part, existing framework and in regulating this kind of algorithm. Yeah, very briefly to introduce to the legal liability for content sharing ISP. I think that's well known among the audience. Usually we divide the copyright infringement liability in two categories. First one, they call them direct infringement. The second is indirect one. In our case, usually the users who are uploading pirate or infringing content is the so-called direct infringer. So it's clear the users directly infringing the content. For the IP, we only consider about the second category, the infringement, the indirect infringement. The legal standard for indirect infringement is also pretty clear. We have a general rule for indirect infringement. We look at the case to see whether internet service provider knows or should know its users infringing others' copyright. If you has this kind of knowledge, still provide help, and then the ISP will be imposed this kind of indirect liability. That's a general rule for indirect infringement. We look at the knowledge, the ISP knowledge to see if knows or should know the infringing activity. But as we know, in most of countries, also in China, we create a safe harbor rules to further restrict ISP duty of care, limit the scope. Here, a typical example of this kind of safe harbor rules created by the US DMCA, the copyright law. Here, the law makes it clear the ISP only needed to bear a limit like the duty of care. Here, including, for example, ISP publicize users' contact information, establish notice and take down procedures, and has adopted a policy of punishing repeated infringers, and also take measures to accommodate technological measures taken by copyright owners. If you have done all these kind of duties, and then you don't need to actively monitor your users' activity. So we call them safe harbor rule, or restrict the general indirect infringement rules. Under the general rule, sometimes the court may require you to do more, right? For example, to take more active measures to prevent infringing activities. Otherwise, you will be bear this kind of indirect infringement liability. But under the safe harbor rule, you only need to, I think that it's a closed list. You only need to do all this kind of list duty of care. And then you just wait at home when to your office to see whether someone has reported an infringing case to you, and then you need to determine whether to take it down. That's the safe harbor rule. Further restrict ISP duty of care. Now I think for the manual algorithmic recommendation system, to determine whether they are lawful under the copyright law, we apply the same analytic framework. Okay, now here I show some, go very quickly. Okay, before we talk about whether we should, how to apply the existing indirect infringement framework to this kind of recommended system, I say a few words about the recent development in the EU law. What we talk about is the indirect infringement framework. We believe in China we still need to apply this kind of framework. But interestingly, in 2019, the European Union has a new directive, the so-called Single Digital Market Directive. Actually, they changed the safe harbor rule. Actually, a little bit, I think they abolished the US style safe harbor rule. They require the ISP when providing content sharing service to get a license, copyright license directly from copyright owner. Otherwise, you have a very high risk of copyright infringement. So they probably changed the indirect infringement regime into a direct infringement regime. So if you treat the ISP as the EU one as a direct infringer, and then the legal framework for regulating recommender system would completely different, right? If you are framed as a direct infringer, we don't care whether you're using recommender system or not. We only look at whether the content displaying in your website is infringing or not. If it's infringing, you bear almost like a strict liability. So whether you apply algorithmic recommender system is an irrelevant thing, right? So that's very interesting. But I personally, I'm be critical of the EU effort legislation. I think that caused a lot of problems due to the time constraint. I will just say very briefly. I think require all the content sharing sites or website to obtain copyright license. In other words, I think that the transaction cost is very high. Right? The ISP needs to approach all the potential copyright owners to get licensed. So you can imagine how high the transaction cost could be. And then the second one, the EU law also create some exception. If you don't have this kind of license, and then we will look at the operation of your business to see whether you have exercise duty of care to try your best effort to get this kind of license. I think the line it's very ambiguous, right? So to enforce this kind of system will cause a very high administrative cost. And that's the third reason, the second reason why I oppose this kind of. The third one is that if you increase the liability for ISP, that probably will increase the threat of collateral censorship. For the ISP, will worry about this kind of direct infringement liability. So they will probably will spend more time or energy to review users' activity, monitor their activity. So they will generate more this kind of collateral censorship against its users that will cause harm to freedom of speech. So that's based on this kind of three reasons. I think the EU new approach is not desirable. I believe China had better to keep the old system and had better to wait and see what happened in EU and then to decide whether China should also change its own law. Even we still insist in the old approach, and then we will apply the so-called indirect infringement framework to analyze whether this kind of algorithmic recommender system is lawful or not under Chinese law. Okay, now we move to the third one. We still put it in the context of indirect infringement framework, not the new EU approach, legal nature. First, we start with the manual recommendation system. Under the Chinese law, if you manually recommend content to your users, we start with the manual recommendation under the Chinese copyright law. As I just mentioned, under the Supreme Court judicial interpretation, it's pretty clear if a website or ISP manually recommend content to its users, and in most of the case, the court will view this recommendation as a kind of manual recommendation as evidence, suggesting the ISP has this kind of knowledge of the user's infringing activity. So that's almost no dispute now under Chinese law. And then the problem is, should the Chinese copyright law treat the algorithmic recommendation and the manual recommendation in the same way? It's I think in over judicial practice and also among over academics, it's a very controversial issue. Here we show you Professor Deng Hongguan is an IP professor in China. He make a comments on this kind of algorithmic recommendation. He believes we should treat the manual recommendation and the algorithmic recommendation equally in the same way. He say here his comment. He say the information recommendation service, if a human review is used, the employee's knowledge of the video involved in the case regarded as a company knowledge. So if you do manually, that means the employees watch review the content. So through this kind of reviewing, we believe the employee get a knowledge of the nature of the copyright infringement. So when you do manually, you know this nature. But if you now replace this kind of human review with this automatic review, the professor believe it should legally be treated the same way. He say they are the same as this human review. They are automatically reflect in responding data. The company's senior management can clearly know the relevant content by accessing the relevant data. That means if you wish, you could access their content, right? Just like when you do this manual review, your employee have access to the content directly, right? You still have this kind of chance to do so. So therefore, using pure technology to screen videos cannot be a reason for information flow recommendation service provider not to know the video involved in the case. That's the interesting comments. In judicial practice, different court have different attitude. The first one is the iQIYI, what's the Toutiao. This case is viewed as the first case on algorithmic recommendations. But if you read the decision carefully, actually, the court did not have a in-depth analysis of the lawfulness of this kind of practice. The court actually in that case inferred defendant's knowledge of the user infringing activity from 9 aspects. The first one I list here is because there are a lot of interaction between the copyright owner and the website. So the court does have evidence showing the defendant in that case actually know there's a infringement in its website. So the court concluded that the defendant ByteDance and TikTok knows and should know that many of the users are conducting infringing acts. And when applying in this kind of background, when applying, you apply algorithmic recommender system. So you should have a higher duty of care. But the court does not make it very clear what it means a higher duty of care. But according to most of IP scholars in China, they probably believe that because you apply the system in the future, you should make sure the infringing activity will not happen again in this kind of internet platform. Otherwise, you will bear this kind of liability. This makes the system closer to a strict liability system. That's the first case, but other courts have shown different attitude. That's another decision also between Tencent and Douyin or the TikTok. In this court, I think that the court show a relatively neutral attitude. The court say to determine whether algorithm recommendation function provided by the defendant constitute indirect infringement, the following factors should be considered: whether the defendant has manually intervened in the algorithmic recommendation function, whether the recommendation function is indiscriminate for all content, or whether the system is indiscriminate for all users. So it's still possible, according to this court, user of the recommender system to argue for non-infringement. That's the case in China. I think in United States, they also have similar decisions. It's quite an old one in 2013, but it's a very famous one, a case between Weihuan and YouTube. In this case, the court say by applying this kind of recommender system, the law does not impose direct infringement against them. The court here say, by evidence also established that YouTube search technology automated system where the user alone choose to view infringing content. The YouTube does not participate in the decision, and that YouTube therefore does not control the infringing activity. He say, whether the system recommends something to the users actually is triggered by the user themselves, because the system look at your past experience or your past attributes, right, to determine whether recommend new content to you. So whether you will have been exposed to new content, that's determined by the users rather than by the system itself. But recently, the U.S. Corporate Office published an influential research report. The report on the section 512 of the Title of 7. That's focused on the ISP liability. In this kind of report, the researcher believe the rule supported by the U.S. court probably is not a good one. They propose to reform this one. They argue that, for example, he say YouTube software and similar content curating and promoting software on other platforms may go beyond what the Congress intend when it sought to protect an OSP from liability for storage at the direction of a user of potentially infringing material. He say, in the safe harbor rule or other liability rules in the past may want to protect the traditional ISP who does not use this kind of content promoting system. But now the more and more ISPs start to use this kind of content promoting software. So you should not treat them as any longer as a protectable ISP under the regime. Interesting, they propose some kind of reform. So for me, I think in my paper, I argue that we should apply the same legal standard, but the content is different. Same standard to manual recommendation and algorithmic recommendation, but the conclusion should be different. For the manual recommendation, it's clear. The recommender needed to bear most of the time indirect infringement liability. But for the automatic recommender system, it's different. That depends on the specific facts in a case. Now I tell you why algorithmic recommendation can be content neutral. So in some case, you probably don't need to bear indirect infringement liability. When we can look at the three stages again. The first stage, when doing this kind of pooling, put all the work into the pool. As I just mentioned, most of the time they do this kind of pooling automatically by the system. So they don't send an employee to review the content directly. So it's got no knowledge about the copyright nature of this kind of work. The second, code launching, you also automatically give weights to some content. They don't know the copyright nature of the work again. The third one is the three types of algorithm, right, used in this kind of system. Most of them look at the attributes of the users or the content or other users. No one care about the content. So when doing this kind of algorithmic recommendation, no one needs to know the nature of the copyright nature of this kind of work. So it could not argue that when doing this kind of recommendation, ISP know someone is doing infringing activity. It's quite different from the manual recommendation system. Okay, that's why I argue against for more duty of care, more liability for this kind of system. The first issue, whether we should impose more duty of care for algorithmic recommenders. When that is under the old law, probably we can argue you should not bear indirect infringement liability. But whether in the future we should increase this kind of duty of care for them, I think that so far that's impossible for a recommender to review the user's content manually. Otherwise, the cost is still very high, right? How to avoid recommending infringing content? I think so far the imaginable solution is send some employees to review all the content before you do this kind of recommendation. But the problem is according to the existing safe harbor rule, we don't encourage ISP to do this kind of monitoring, to this kind of reviewing or monitoring. Why? Because we believe the first, this kind of manual review will increase the business cost, right, of the ISP, and then this kind of cost will be transferred to impose all the users. They will also cause other negative alternatives. First one, they will increase the cost of all users posting content. If you have to do this kind of manual review, that means once a user upload a content and then need to wait for this kind of manual review, they cost quite a lot of time for the users. So the user's cost will increase. The second one, they will increase the user's freedom of speech, right? When they're doing this kind of content review, there's a lot of this kind of censorship. So there's a increase the collateral censorship. That's the price paid by the society. That's why in the past we don't encourage ISP to do this kind of manual review. Now, even we have a new technology to do this kind of algorithmic recommendation, but the cost to do this kind of manual review is still there. It has not been reduced effectively by new technology. So we still should avoid imposing this kind of duty. on the ISP. So that's why I argue against to increase more duty to ISP. Another one, someone say we may increase duty of copyright filtering to the ISP. The system works pretty easy. If someone send a notice to the ISP, and then ISP will apply this kind of filtering system to prevent the same content from being uploaded by its user in the future. I think before I wrote I write this article, I also published another article on this kind of issue, whether ISP should bear the copyright filtering duty. My answer is yes. And several years ago, later on, the EU adopted its new legislation, support this kind of idea. So I'm pretty happy. But here, I argue that even the ISP should bear this kind of duty of copyright filtering. That does not mean because of the algorithmic recommendation service, the ISP needed to bear more liability. That's two completely irrelevant things. The algorithmic recommendation is separate from the technology of copyright filtering, right? So even copyright filtering technology now is available. That doesn't mean the ISP needed to bear a higher liability for algorithmic recommendation. We should treat the two issues separately. But in China or in this world, a lot of scholars are confused on this kind of two technologies. They say because you have potential to use the copyright filtering, and then now we should increase the liability for algorithmic recommendation. I think that's the wrong approach. Okay, that's my argument against. Next one, probably very quickly, I talk about the next issue, whether that's a black box problem for algorithmic recommendations. Here we quote another influential IP professor's article on this kind of issue, Professor Li Jiang. He argues that the design of a recommendation algorithm itself is completely a black box operation full of various exquisite calculation based on copyright owners and his work. He basically argues when designing this kind of algorithmic system, you do behind the curtain. No one knows what's the trick, right? Maybe you configure the system to favor some infringing content. That's possible, right? You only you can pay more attention or give more weight to pirate content, so attract more audience, right? But we don't know what's the function or the mechanism of our system. So behind the curtain, we don't know what's happened. So it's a black box. So if we don't know what happened, we have best to treat as a unreliable system, may have a lot of calculations. So in this kind of scenario, he believes, according to the principle of equal rights and obligation, the user of the recommendation algorithm should bear a higher duty of care for content recommended by the algorithm. Actually, if you look into the mechanism of this kind of system, it's unlikely for internet users to configure its system to favor pirate contents. Why? Actually, the system only care about whether a content is popular or not, right? Only need to know this kind of knowledge. They don't care whether it's a pirate one or licensed one. If a licensed one is popular, and then give more weight to that. If the pirate one, they do the same thing, right? So that's no incentive for the ISP really to figure out whether the content is pirate or not. So even we recognize there's a black box, but unlikely in the black box they will adopt a mechanism favoring pirate one. So I think the black box problem is not a real threat to the copyright owner. Maybe in other areas they have this kind of problem, right? If you want to know to make an informed decision, maybe you want to disclose the detail to the outside. But in terms of protecting copyright work, I think we have no really need to disclose the mechanism to the public. So how to deal with this kind of a black box problem? I think we still could rely on the traditional or the so-called no notice and stay down procedure. If I find something is infringing and then send a notice, and then you should keep it down. and prevented it from being recommended again. This kind of mechanism should work. So we don't need to care about the black box problem. Okay, I'm running out of time. Here's my conclusion. I just list here very briefly. I basically in my paper argue the mission of ISP is not only content storage. They also have a mission of helping users to promoting content. There's no direct connection between algorithmic recommendation and the ISP knowledge of user infringement. So technology progress does not justify more duty of care, including content further. The technology progress might justify more duty of care, including content filtering, but does not negate the legality of algorithmic recommendation service itself. Excessive, sometimes in exceptional situation, if there are a lot manual intervention into the algorithmic recommendation, it might result in ISP's knowledge of users' infringing activity. And then in that kind of scenario, you may impose liability on the ISP. That's my argument in my paper. Okay, thank you.
So what I'm going to talk about today is a highly controversial and important issue that perhaps many of you have heard about or read about this topic on a daily basis in the past few months, which is about the question of critical minerals. I wanted to talk about China's strategies in this space, but then I thought it would be better for me to talk more broadly about the global situation and put China in that broader context, and to talk about China's strategies and how we respond to this global issue collectively. So what I'm going to talk about in the following 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about what are critical minerals as a concept and why it is important. And then I'll move on to talk about the broader contexts about the global industry policy, especially in the green space, in terms of the global green transition. And then in our contexts, to explain further the importance of critical minerals and the rise of critical mineral strategies. And then to reflect on the critical mineral strategies taken by major economies globally on international economic legal order. And that includes international trade and international investment regimes that we have today. And then I'll provide a little bit of reflection from two perspectives. The first is the global implications, and second is how we understand China's policies and strategies in that broader context, and what kind of implications or recommendations we should give to governments globally. So the first question, what are critical minerals? And I think for most of you are using electric cars or electric vehicles, and see the growing production and trade in this space. You would have known that it is very important to have the upstream supply of what we know as critical minerals to support the production of key components of electric vehicles. And that applies to what we know as the renewable energy technologies as well. So in the next few slides, including this one, I'm showing you some data, latest data provided by International Energy Agency in terms of the appropriate usage of critical minerals in the production of some of the most advanced and most widely used green technologies today. And as you can see, that quite a few critical minerals are necessary for the production of and the promotion, frankly, of the green technologies, which is the defining priority in today's policymaking worldwide. And what this brings us, if we're talking about the Paris Agreement net zero goals, and also the government's efforts to achieve these goals, we're talking about a phenomenal growth in the demand for critical minerals in the next decades. And this is also from the data collected by the International Energy Agency. And you can read the latest report. They have published about 3 reports consecutively. And the latest report basically provides an updated information about the demands globally for the critical minerals. For example, the demand for lithium is set to increase by 90%. The demand for nickel and cobalt may increase by 70%. And demand for copper and rare earths may increase by 40% in the next 2 decades, just because of the global race for green transition. And yet, we have a very uneven distribution of the resources in different economies. So as you can see that in terms of the location of the resources, and that's where you can produce or extract the resources, quite a few number of countries control one or more than one critical minerals. And that's where we have the resources. So in other words, the resources are distributed in a handful of economies. Now, after extraction, you can't use the critical minerals directly for production in the midstream or downstream products. Instead, these minerals need to be processed or purified for the production purpose. So that's why the processing step or the midstream of the production process or the supply chains matters. And as you can see, that's where most of the criticism comes against China, because China is still a major player in the processing of most of the critical minerals. And what that means is that after extraction, these critical minerals need to be exported to China for processing. And then the processed critical minerals can be exported from China to the countries they will be used for downstream production. Now, with that background, and the question is why we're having this kind of challenge in terms of critical mineral supply chains. And if you think about critical minerals as upstream of a green industry policy or the policies for a green transition, we have seen a phenomenal growth of industry policies for green transition in the past few years. And it has become a global issue and global policy priority. And it's because of this competition and because of this race for a green transition globally that have increased significantly the demand for critical minerals. I have listed out several examples there on this slide. As you can see, in the US, the most well-known example is what we call the Inflation Reduction Act, which tries to essentially ally shoring some of the key components for electric cars. And what it does is to ensure that, for example, the batteries are produced in the nearby countries in North America, so that the final products, electric cars, can be eligible for US subsidies. So essentially, it's an industry subsidy or industry policy trying to support by relocating the resources in a particular sector. And that's what we know as industry policy. And the Inflation Reduction Act also requires that the source of critical minerals for the production of batteries and electric cars must not come from certain countries. And that includes China, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to be eligible for the subsidies either. So what that tells us is a industry policy combined with geopolitical concerns. And the concerns about supply chains and the change of policy to ensure the manufacturing at home or in trusted partners. So that's what we have heard about recently, reshoring, friendshoring, and I will come back to talk about that concept a little more. Now, if you look at the European Union, it also has been a while that the EU has tried to ratchet up its own green transition by introducing a number of significant regulations and policies, and that includes the Europeans' Green Deal, and most recently and most controversially, I think, is what we call the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms, the CBAM. China also has its own plans and strategies for green transition, and we have heard and see from China's policies and regulatory documents in terms of the climate policies and actions. And China has collaborated with the UN authorities in terms of achieving the relevant climate change goals and have taken significant actions in that direction. But again, China also has relied on some typical and standard industry policy instruments, including subsidies. And despite the fact that there is, at least appears to be a very good intention, right? It's a green transition. Everyone tries to adopt mechanisms and policies to combat climate change. But often these policies have a mix of objectives, right? It could be for the protection of a particular industry. It could be for economic nationalism, as we have talked about the US strategies. It could be for the geopolitical concerns and so on, and national security is the defining term there as well. So we have seen the mix of objectives supported by a wide array of green policies. And that is the broader picture we're facing at the moment. And finally, at the international level, we also have seen, especially in the post-COVID era, that the international organizations such as the World Trade Organization has increasingly reorientated its own priorities from a trade-oriented approach to emphasizing the significance of using trade policies and trade policy instruments to achieve non-trade values, including climate change. Now, in that broader context, to understand critical minerals as an upstream sector for the green transition, and what kind of strategies we have seen being adopted or developed in different countries. Here, in 2 consecutive papers, we tried to explain or map out these strategies. In one paper, we basically try to divide these economies into 2 categories. The first is where you do not have sufficient assets or resources, and therefore there is a strong need, a pressing need for these countries to adopt strategies to secure the supply or sufficient supply of critical minerals just for their green transition. Now, if you divide the countries into the two categories, you can pretty much see that the resource-rich countries have relied predominantly on defensive strategies. In other words, they're trying to use different kind of trade policies or economic policies to protect their own assets or resources, or at least to use the resources as a bargaining chip for exchange for some support or efforts by resource-seeking countries to help them build their own industries. So we have seen some typical examples, for example, adopted by Indonesia and other countries, restricting the export of the critical minerals they have. For example, nickel in Indonesia, and also cobalt in Congo, and so on. So that is a growth, kind of the current trend in resource-rich countries trying to adopt different kinds of policies to protect their own resources and also to promote their midstream and downstream industries. Another typical policy instruments used in this space is investment. In other words, there has been increasing use of national security, and especially in advanced resource-rich countries such as Canada and Australia, are using the investment screening to block foreign investment in critical minerals or energy and resources sectors in general, just because they have concerns about their security. So, for example, in Australia, there has been recent actions to block Chinese investment in Australia's resources sector, and there are also recent examples in Canada where the Canadian government ordered a divestment by Chinese investors in certain critical mineral sectors. So that is another typical example. When it comes to proactive strategies, these are mainly adopted by resource-seeking countries, as I said, that do not have sufficient resources at home, and therefore they need to rely on the external strategies, or what we call the outward-looking strategies, to ensure they have a stable and secure supply of critical minerals. Now, what they have done, and the typical example here is the European Union, they have used different kinds of policy tools and strategies, tries to make sure they can secure the supply chain resilience. And this includes the use of free trade agreements, and of course, including the WTO and investment treaties, and new rules in these treaties to ensure that they can have more advanced rules in their for their benefit. Now, so what's the implications for the international trade and international investment regimes as examples under international economic legal order? The current system, we have at least two major kind of components under either the trade regime and the investment regime, right? The global trade regime has the multilateral trade agreement, an institution which is the WTO. And then you have a numerous free trade agreements. So that's the current regime. And under an investment regime, you also have certain but very limited number of rules under WTO, which we can see as the multilateral provisions. But also traditionally and typically international investment is governed by the bilateral investment treaties and increasingly by investment chapters in free trade agreements. So let's just look at very briefly the trade rules. The trade rules currently we only have a very, very limited protection for critical minerals, right? So you have import duties, trade remedies, and restrictions. One problem with this is that these rules are not actually strictly enforced at the WTO at the moment, and not necessarily under FTA and the free trade agreements as well. And there is also increasing trend to use the exceptions to protect national interests. So what happened in the EU example is that they have used the existing or future or new free trade agreements, trying to create more advanced rules to make sure that the resource-rich countries would not restrict exports, would provide equal treatment to their investors, as well as to provide platforms or at least best endeavors for cooperation. In the investment space, we have also saying, but also between the selected partners, they're trying to enhance screening mechanisms and trying to increase regulatory transparency and facilitate investment between the partners. Because if you think about critical minerals, it can't only be trade, you also want to have some interests in the assets, which requires investment in the resource-rich countries. Another recent development is what we know as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The first agreements reached under the IPEF. Well, I can talk just like that. So the first agreement reached under IPEF is what we call as the supply chain agreements. But that's a framework led by the United States, excluding China. So the question for us to think about is whether this kind of selected limited group can actually address supply chain issues without China being a partner. Now, what's the suggestion for the international organizations or collective efforts at the international level? As I said at the WTO Public Forum a few weeks ago, it is very important to include China in this discussion, right? And not only because China is a major player in global supply chains, but also because China remains a top trading partner with many economies, including a majority of economies in the IPEF. Another argument here is to say that if you look at the IPEF supply chain agreement, all of these components can be discussed by including China in the collaboration. And the economies in IPEF would be better off with China in the deliberation, because you're talking about supply chain risks and disruptions, you're talking about crisis, mobilizing investment, and so on. All of these issues are critical issues for supply chains, and you can't really sufficiently address these issues without involving China. Another important thing here to reflect on at the international level is that we're still living in the reality where we have significant increase of protectionism and big labor policies, unilateralism, which have a significant impact on the global trading system and the world economy more generally. So the question is think about how we can actually regain the relevance and the functionality of the global trading system. So these policies that we're currently seeing, either in terms of confrontation, in terms of competition, or friend-shoring selective engagement, could actually be dealt with under a rules-based system. When it comes to China, I think it is very important to understand China's role in the global supply chains, and especially in critical minerals. And to really, so we have a paper on it, we discussed it very in detail about why China is not actually a dominant force in global supply of critical minerals. We also criticized the argument about why China is not really a disruption or did not have a disruptive strategy. And instead, that China should be treated as a partner in the global supply chain issues, including critical minerals. Well, a reason for that is because we think that China's strategies in the critical minerals space has consistently and predominantly focused on addressing its own challenges and issues at home. It's very similar to the strategies and policies adopted by other major economies globally. So if you are interested in this topic, and there are 2 papers already online and under peer review, but I look forward to discussing with you further. I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you very much for Professor Weihuan Zhou's presentation, and his presentation focused on the critical minerals strategy. He exploring these issues from the international trade law perspective, and providing the global implications for China and also the international society. And so the next session is Q&A session. We still have Q&A session.
We still have some time.
Yeah,
we can still do like 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah. We only have 2 minutes left. Okay. But we still can have a Q&A session. So I have see that there are many questions online raised by the audience. So maybe the speakers can pick up the questions.
A really simple question for Guobin. Thank you for your interesting presentation, which get me thinking. The amount of time I was on hold on the phone call, they play music. Does that infringement copyright? Anyway, my question is, do you think the liability of ISPs will change if they are benefiting, for example, making money from subscribers' behavior, including their infringement behavior?
Yeah, I think a very interesting question. Personally, I believe liability rules for ISP probably will be changing to something close to the Yuan in the future. But now I think I'm not sure whether the technology has already developed this kind of really effective measures for ISP to deal with the ingredient activities. If we still need to wait, sure, the technology probably will be at this stage, probably still exist the safe harbor rules or other life rules, not the radical one adopted in the future. If the new technology makes it more efficient for the ISP to prevent this kind of activity, and then probably need to change the law to strike a new balance. I think this kind of change is ongoing process. That's all the time. That's my observation. But whether the fact that ISP should benefit from the infringing activities will itself force us to increase the liability for ISP. I think that's depends. If the ISP benefit from infringing activities, but also help to promote this kind of license content, all this create more social welfare, and also we believe require ISP to bear more costs. For example, to do manual review is not cost effective. In that kind of scenario, even we know ISP benefit from infringing activities, we probably still are willing or reluctant to impose more duty on the ISP. Otherwise, they'll cause harm to the social welfare. So the key issue, the fact not whether ISP benefit from infringing activities. The key issue whether allow the ISP to prevent this kind of infringing activities, whether it's cost efficient. Right? That's my thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for interaction between Professor Cui and Dr. Bai. Any other questions? Oh, okay, Professor. Yeah.
Well, I have a quick question for Weihuan. Thanks for your very insightful presentation. So you mentioned that there is sort of systematic shift from the trade-oriented to a non-trade-oriented consideration like climate, supply chain sustainability. And we actually, I can see there's a similar trend in investment policy making from investor protection towards non-economic interests from the policy making perspective. But at least in investment practice and arbitration, we still see some of the cases where arbitral tribunal just still completely ignored some environmental consideration, even though that's drafted in the treaty. So I wonder, how does this change in the policy making being translated, for instance, in the WTO jurisprudence? Do we see a changing attitude in practice?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The short answer is not yet. There has been several cases. So we know that there is a kind of a panel body crisis in the WTO, where we don't have the panel body, so that affects the functionality of the whole dispute settlement system. We have had a very few cases that had to deal with the nexus between trade and non-trade values. A very typical one, and the first one actually used arbitration for appeal, is the Turkey pharmaceutical products case. Professor Yang Guohua is a chair in the panel, in the arbitration panel. So that is one of the few cases we have had dealing with that issue. Now, if you look at the WTO at the institutional level, it's a huge change. I think it's a fundamental shift in the focus. And the WTO's public forum and other events and announcements or speeches, you have saying that they're completely focused on sustainability issues and technology and digital transformation issues. What they're trying to do is trying to say how the system, the WTO and the trade rules can still be relevant in this space. So that's the shift I'm talking about. Instead of just talking about trade liberalization, and negotiating of trade rules to facilitate and protect trade liberalization, they're talking about how you can use trade instruments, how you can use trade and trade rules to facilitate the achievement of the broader goals, economic goals, sustainability, climate change, gender balance, inclusiveness, and everything like that, right? So that's a significant shift. Now, in terms of dispute settlement system, I think we still have to wait and see whether the tribunals would actually make any changes or shift in that direction as well. It's very interesting because currently, as I said, we only have a partially functioning system, which means that whether, for example, at the panel stage, when the panel made a decision, whether that actually can be counted as jurisprudence. Because the panel decision in the future may well be changed by the panel body, or even by the arbitrators in the future cases. So that's one thing to watch. And the second thing is to say, if the panel or panels are to follow the previous jurisprudence, and then we're going to remain in this debate about whether the existing jurisprudence strike a right balance between trade and non-trade values, and how you can actually change it. Now, I have my own thought about it, and I also have written a case note on the Turkey pharmaceutical case. I think it is very important to also ensure that the system, including the dispute settlement system, especially in the absence of progress in the negotiation space or the rulemaking space, that the WTO tribunals could play a role in shifting the jurisprudence or the trade rules in the same direction. So you can keep the consistency and the relevance of the system, and particularly what the WTO tries to do now and in the future. That's what we are having at the moment. But I'm hoping that the tribunals could actually develop the jurisprudence or even change the jurisprudence, because the WTO does not really have a strict precedent system. So you could actually change jurisprudence in a way that is more aligned with the current direction of the system.
All right. Thank you, Professor Zhou. Since we have already run out of time and currently it's 11:38, so I think we need to go directly to the closing ceremony, and I will give the authority to Professor Ron Jun to give the speech. Close.
尊敬的各位与会嘉宾，联合研究中心的各位同事们，经过1天半的探讨，我们对政策和法律的相互交织影响的诸多议题进行了深入交流，既包含数据、算法等科技前沿问题，也包含环境保护等人类共同面临的问题，并探讨了公司法、证券法、国际投资法等当中的新问题。这些精彩的发言对于我们理解政策和法律的关系有着重要的作用。我期待着清华大学法学院和西南威尔士大学法学院未来的长期合作，我们一起共同推进国际经济法和国际商法领域的学术研究和人才培养。谢谢。
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and esteemed colleagues from Tsinghua UNSW Joint Research Center for International Commercial and Economic Law. After a day and a half of discussions, we have delved deep into a myriad of issues where policy and law intricately intersect. Our discussions spanned cutting-edge topics like data, algorithms, and other technological frontiers, as well as pressing global concerns such as environmental protection. We also explored emerging challenges with corporate law, securities law, international investment law, and more. These enlightening discussions have significantly contributed to our understanding of the intricate relationship between policy and law. I eagerly anticipate the long-lasting collaboration between Tsinghua University School of Law and the University of New South Wales Law School. Together, we will continue to advance academic research and foster talent in the fields of international economic and commercial law. Thank you.
Or I guess it comes to my turn and as the last speaker. So, dear colleagues and friends, thank you so much for your participation in this year's Tsinghua UNSW Joint Research Center for International Commercial and Economic Law Conference, jointly organized by Tsinghua Law School and the China International Business and Economic Law Civil Center of the UNSW Law Faculty of Law and Justice. In the 1.5 days conference, we reflected on and discussed rigorously some of the major challenges facing China's external and internal economic policies and regulatory efforts in the post-pandemic era. We hope that the discussions have helped enhance understanding of China's regulatory developments in these areas and their global implications. Personally, I want to thank and congratulate the speakers for your great work and contributions to the relevant fields of scholarship and policymaking. I also want to thank the participants attending in person and online for your questions and active engagement. Since established in 2019, the Tsinghua UNSW Joint Research Center for International Commercial and Economic Law has played a critical role in promoting quality research collaboration in a range of forms, leading to impactful outcomes, even during the pandemic. We are therefore reasonably confident that through collective efforts, Tsinghua Law School and UNSW Faculty of Law and Justice will continue to strengthen and expand our collaboration and develop even a wider range of activities and events with stronger outcomes that meet our shared research interests and goals. I want to conclude by thanking the efforts of our Tsinghua colleagues for hosting us. And thank you again. And we look forward to reciprocating your hospitality in our next event and to working with you to advance the quality and global impact of joint research programs and events in the years ahead. Thank you.